Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Could we start? My name is Mark Ott. I'm the Director General of the Egmont Institute, and in the name of Egmont and of all the team, very pleased to welcome you tonight for this very interesting conference that has been organized in cooperation with the Heinrich Böll Stiftung and the American Committee for East-West Accord. The topic tonight is Germany's new Ostpolitik and Russia, from strategic partnership to geopolitical competition. I think it's a very timely topic after what we've seen as the collapse of the post-Cold War order. We seem to be back to the future with the return of geopolitics and balance of powers, with Germany and Russia, the continental powers par excellence, at the center of the game. Or to paraphrase Robert Kaplan, it's the revenge of geography, or maybe the revenge of history. Those who see a resurgent Russia as a sort of threat, it might be considering that it's simply Russia trying to get back what it sees as its rightful place in the concert of nations after an eclipse of the post-Cold War period. Very often my feeling is that we've not heeded warnings when it came to what the Russians were telling us. And I remember a conference Lavrov gave in this institute at the end of 2013, when after saying very few nice words about bilateral relations with Belgium and how beautiful the European Union was, said now something about your neighborhood policy. Your neighborhood policy is in my neighborhood too, and so if you don't pay attention to what my interests are, we're going to be in trouble, and indeed we have been. So, and I must say quite frankly, for all its cynicism, the speech of Mr. Putin at the United Nations this week scored a few points, especially when it described the catastrophic consequence of Western adventures in the Middle East. We are very fortunate today to have this meeting chaired by Dr. Gilbert, DOCTOROW, the author of a very nice book called Does Russia Have a Future? I don't think we could have a more competent and more up-to-date chairman for this. So without further ado, I will leave you the chair, Dr. DOCTOROW.
Thank you so much, and I express gratitude to the Institute Egmont for hosting us tonight in this wonderful conference room. I express my gratitude to the Böll Stiftung for co-sponsoring, and we are very fortunate to have an extremely interesting, competent panel to talk about an unusual subject. Sadly, it's unusual because the issue that we have on the agenda today has not received much attention, not only in the mainstream press, but also, or even in the alternative press, but has been largely ignored by professional journalists. I'd like to start out with the ground rules, and then I will make a brief statement expanding on the several sentences describing tonight's subject that you all received with the announcement invitation. Now, we have 90 minutes at our disposal. I would expect that the first two-thirds of that will be the panel responding to a couple of questions, responding to the position statements of one another. And then the last third will be open to the floor. Obviously, given the expertise of our panel, I imagine that the subjects will go far and broad. But I hope for the first 60 minutes we can stay close to this very underexplored subject that is the title of tonight's event. The timing. We have two questions, 5 minutes for each of the panelists to respond to each question, and then a summary of 10 minutes for them to respond to one another. Now, coming back to the expanding on the description of the subject of the challenge that we're going to discuss. What is extraordinary about Germany's position and why is it worth looking at, particularly when there is no formal doctrine or policy enunciated by the Merkel coalition. Following the change of regime in Kiev on February 22nd, 2014, there was a growing confrontation between Russia and the West over Ukraine, and at this outset of this, it was widely assumed in many places that Angela Merkel would act as a go-between to find a compromise with President Putin. After all, as a fluent Russian speaker, we were told by the press repeatedly, she had all the necessary expertise to accomplish this. She also had met frequently with Vladimir Putin. In the Kremlin as well, Germany was traditionally viewed as their intercessor, their advocate for Russia within the EU. However, as the months rolled on, from late spring to the summer of 2014, it became clear that Germany was in fact the EU leader in the policy of applying ever more severe sanctions to Russia. First over its takeover of the Crimea, and then over its intervention or involvement in the Donbass conflict, which was becoming a civil war. This has remained the case till today, this overview of where Germany and Chancellor Merkel sit. However, Germany's policy became very confusing in December 2014 and January 2015, when Chancellor Merkel veered off in a new direction, pushing for the Minsk negotiations to settle the now acute conflict in Donbass. She then went to the States and defended the Minsk II ceasefire and roadmap to settlement before hostile questioning from leading US politicians in Congress. At this point, both in the West and in Russia, serious questioning began over the zigzags in German conduct. Given Angela Merkel's well-known dislike for big-picture pronouncements, for broad policies, no doctrine has emerged. But we may ask whether by deed, if not by word, Germany has not entered upon a new Ostpolitik that is markedly different from the accommodation with Russia that was the quintessence of Willy Brandt's policy when the term was first coined. How are we to, assuming that there's agreement in the panel that there is a new Ostpolitik, how are we to understand this? I propose this evening to look at it initially, at least from two angles, one of them historical and the other economic. The historical angle was just touched upon a few minutes ago. After the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end, well, first the end of the Cold War and then the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was assumed by realist thinkers on international relations, and not only by realists, that the world was returning to a pre-World War I game plan of competing nation states pursuing their own interests rather than ideology. In that pre-World War arrangement in Europe, Germany occupied a position of near hegemon, particularly hegemon in East Central Europe, or what was called at the time Mitteleuropa. If we look around us today, one can find certain signs of a similar hegemony exercised by Germany, and by Germany's forming what is a close strategic alliance with its immediate neighbors among the new European Union states, starting with Poland. Poland has been promoted ever since the Kaczynskis left office, and Poland and Germany have forged especially close ties. Chancellor Merkel was known to have promoted Donald Tusk to his present position, a very visible position in the presidency of the European Council. Germany, going back to 2008, supported, at least tacitly supported, certainly never created difficulties for the Eastern Partnership, which was being run by Sweden and by Poland. This tolerance for the Eastern Partnership is directly leading us to the fall of the Yanukovych government and to the crisis that we have seen since February 2014. And so I leave it there, and I ask our panel whether or not this geopolitical analysis, which is sketched in just 2-3 lines, makes sense to them, or if they have an alternative understanding of why Germany has such a prominent role and why it has done these zigzags over the last year. Now, as we approach the question, I'd like to set out the order of response, and that to start with Stephen Walt, then Sergei LAGODINSKY, Hans-Joachim GIESSMAN as in third place, and Richard SAKWA will round it out. And for question 2, we will reverse the order. So I turn this over then to Professor Walt.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to be here. I will focus mostly on the historical side of this. I would argue that German foreign policy for quite some time has been shaped by a number of enduring historical influences. First of all is its geography, its position in Middle Europa. Geography determines what many states do, and Germany is no exception. Second, obviously, its history, both pre-1945, both the First and Second World War and what that has done for Germany's position in Europe, but also the long partnership with the United States in NATO and its role in the Cold War division of Europe. However, it's worth noting, even there, as was mentioned by Dr. Doctorow, there were some differences between Washington and Bonn, most notably in Brandt's Ostpolitik. And the third historical element has been the post-World War II commitment, very deep commitment, I would argue, to a set of liberal ideas, not, of course, exclusively in Germany, to be embodied in the European Union. You could put this in rather simplest term by saying Germany does not do power politics, and has largely eschewed a power political role, or what one might think of as a realpolitik approach to world politics. I think this has several obvious implications. It's still extremely difficult for Germany to have a genuinely independent and assertive foreign policy, especially in the realm of security. Less so in economics, as we've seen with the Greek crisis. Because obviously if it tries to have a really energetic, assertive, independent foreign policy, its neighbors get very uncomfortable very quickly. The result is Germany always wants to embed its foreign policy within a larger European context, to be seen as acting within European institutions. But given how the EU operates, that means it's largely incapable of taking any bold steps in any particular way, because the EU doesn't do bold. Third is this commitment to the European Union, and in particular the rule of law, very powerful. And you see this, I think, in the reluctant agreement to create the euro back in the 1990s, which many Germans had deep misgivings about, but it was seen as central to the broader European project, central to winning French acquiescence in reunification. And finally, all of this, I think, has led to a theme within German foreign policy, independent of who the chancellors have been, to be on good terms with as many neighbors as possible. Now, that leads me to sort of think of German foreign policy as essentially semi-independent, innately conservative, wanting to preserve familiar institutions like NATO, the EU, etc. for as long as possible, and certainly not wanting to be blamed for damaging any of these institutions. The commitment to liberal ideals makes it hard to resist pressure from others for the eastward expansion of the European Union and the eastward expansion of NATO, even though, again, Germans occasionally had reservations about that. Given the embrace of liberal ideas, the tendency to see the European Union as benign means that you don't see the threat that eastward expansion of either the EU or NATO might in fact pose to others. You've given up realpolitik, so you don't see how what appears to be benign activity might in fact impede others' interests. Now, having said all that, I would also argue, and this will be my last point, that Germany has not, in fact, been embracing the strict American line with regard to Russia or the East, even in the wake of the Ukraine crisis. Recall that, of course, Germany opposed the Iraq War in 2003. It opposed Ukraine and Georgia entering into NATO at the Bucharest summit. It did make some concessions regarding the final communique, which was unfortunate, but it opposed the direct movement towards bringing them in, which is something the United States wanted. The American view since Ukraine arose is that, of course, all Western policies towards the East since 1992 have been totally benign and a great resounding success. And of course, the problems in Ukraine are solely the responsibility and the fault of one individual, Vladimir Putin, who's now responsible for conducting a 19th century foreign policy, as John Kerry put it. So it's all Putin's fault, and the only remedy is to teach him a lesson and to restore deterrence. That's the American view, but that has not been the policy that the Germans have followed. They did not support sanctions against Russia until after the shoot down of the Malaysian airliner, which I think had a galvanizing effect on German public opinion. Then they did, I think largely for political, not economic reasons. They have consistently opposed arming Ukraine and consistently emphasized the need for diplomacy, recognizing correctly, in my view, that arming Ukraine would not in fact solve the problem, but in fact would make it worse, and largely at the expense of Ukrainians. And then earlier this year, Merkel put the brakes in certain respects on further development of the so-called Eastern Partnership, saying that a visa-free zone was not going to happen anytime soon. So if I were to summarize this, I would say that it is neither Ostpolitik nor neoconservatism, but is also still not an independent foreign policy.
Thanks so much, and it's a privilege and pleasure to participate in such a high-ranking discussion. You framed the topic and your invitation spoke about a confusing policy line of Germany. When I read this, I actually did realize what a difference it makes to be inside and outside of something which you were judging. I do not see how the policies of the German government is confusing during the past year. One reason for this is that German policies towards Russia were never pro-Russian, continuously pro-Russian during the history of the unified Germany. Actually, it was the Schröder-Fischer government which, for the first time, started speaking about strategic partnership as an integral part of a German foreign policy. Later on, this was remodeled into a modernization partnership, which also had its reasons, because it was, and this is my interpretation, it was increasingly difficult to talk common strategies with a regime which has decided that its future is not going to be liberal democracy. And this was clear in 2006 when the modernization partnership has been enforced. Just briefly, because you asked what are the factors there which make the Merkel government and many others, and opposition in Germany, at least in part, so critical towards what is going on in eastern Ukraine. I would like to offer a couple of explanations within the time limit which is left to me. I think that one important thing is that there is, at least on behalf of a part of German society, understanding about transitional processes that took place in Russia. Because Germany, at least 1/3 of it approximately, is a country of transition itself. But transitionalists, as I would call them, we have now two sorts of transitionists, and we see it in Europe. There are liberal transitionists, those who have become convinced of the liberal values that this transition has promised them, and the what I would call modern transitionists, in order not to use the word anti-liberal or non-liberal transitionists, those who have a traumatic transition experience and therefore try to find kind of a third way of dealing with this transition towards democracy and post-Soviet transition. And I think that Germany has become the motor for this movement of liberal transitionists. And it's not only because Germany as a country, but also because the person of Merkel has went through this transition. And therefore, while Germany kind of mirrored itself in the transition happening in Russia in the 1990s, and it tried to mirror itself in the beginning of this millennium, it did not recognize itself in this transition outcome starting with 2006. Therefore, there is this backlash and trying to show that there is a limit for alliances and for partnership. I do think that another reason is that Germans are proud of their revolution in 1989, if you want to call it this way. Many people call it this way. And they also mirrored themselves in the Maidan, where they saw people who actually opted for liberties and for freedom. They do mirror themselves, they recognize themselves also in the feelings and anxieties of many Eastern European countries, of Poland and the Baltic states. And they also are, and Stephen already mentioned this, institutionalists, and have a very legalistic way and outlook of the world. So what happened now with the intrusion, the Russians' intrusion into Ukraine and the following war, and I would not use the civil war term, which you used, to make it clear, there was an invasion there, not just in the Crimea, but also in eastern Ukraine. When they see how rules, agreements have been violated by one actor, it's in the German nature, political nature of this German political animal to say, this is the red line that you crossed. And I think that there is no surprise there. There is no confusion there. This is a clear-cut position that we are seeing. I don't know how much time is left out of my 5 minutes. 1 more minute. I would use another point, which I think is important. No country is a unified object, even if the realist school would at least assume it at the outset. In Germany, there are many different actors. And nobody was surprised, or at least very few people were surprised, that Merkel is not a huge fan of the Kremlin regime. What was surprising, and it was interesting, is the evolution of the Social Democrats, who are part of the government. And this is the interesting part, to see more closely how far the foreign minister has become the deciding card and the deciding factor, and his party, like Ralf Mützenich, who is the spokesperson, who was the spokesperson for foreign policy, and Niels Annen, who is the spokesperson for the foreign policy, who have become very outspoken critics of what is going on in Russia. And I think part of it is also a personal feeling of being, I wouldn't say betrayed, but at least lied to by many of their partners in Russia, and by the expectations that were not fulfilled. And therefore, these politicians also feel a personal responsibility to act.
Yeah, thank you very much also for inviting me. But first of all, I would agree to what what the previous speaker has said about the common thread. I do not see the confusions, or would not agree to the point that Merkel has a policy that's confusing. But what can be seen here is that there is a discrepancy between the perception and the self-perception of Germany. It started off already shortly after the ending of the Cold War, when Germany recognized prematurely Croatia and Slovenia, and all of a sudden realized Germany can make a difference, and it was not prepared for that. And actually, it is still continuing until now. Germany has difficulties to accept a role as a normal state in Europe. And it has not even yet defined own national interests. It's really a struggle over defining these things. We have currently a discussion going on about a new white book, which for the first time will be a comprehensive endeavor by the whole government. But the idea behind is really to start to discuss what are Germany's national interests. This being said, I mean, I can add an anecdotal story to that. Former Federal Army General told me recently that he had a discussion here in Brussels about Germany's stance on the Allied operation towards Libya, and when Germany said we will not engage, people in the headquarters of NATO thought, well, this is a very smart move of Germany. Something must be behind that. There must be a strategy behind it. But there was no strategy. There was no stance on the German side how to react on this matter. And that is what makes Germany being looked at from time to time as a factor that is not reliable or not consequent in its policy. But if you go into detail, then you find out that there are some elements that have a kind of permanent role, or have played a permanent role in Germany's foreign policy development after the ending of the Cold War. The first one is there is a strong interest in integration. That is economically interesting for Germany, of course, but it's also politically interesting. It is not true that Germany is not, as it was said, it's not doing power politics. It's not aware that it's doing power politics as part of the European integration. It is the biggest elephant, the biggest dog in town, and whatever it's doing, even though it has not clearly outspoken policy, whatever it's doing, it has impact on other countries, and we have seen that most recently in the financial crisis, and we do see that also now. So integration, a country which has 9 neighbors, which is economically dependent on exports and trade, that is also politically has experience that is much better to create influence and to make impact, not as a middle macht in Europe, but as a part of a larger integration, matters. Secondly, being a member of the Western Alliance and part of NATO, Stephen Walt spoke about that, is also kind of a continued factor of Germany's interest. The third one is Russia, right? There is an understanding that Russia, there's no security without Russia in Europe, which means also that there's no security in Russia without a cooperative relationship with Russia, between Russia and Germany. That is a kind of common understanding, and I would also agree to what was said before, that there's a lot of disappointment now about what Russia has done. And I recently attended a meeting with the German foreign minister who openly said that we should remind the Hamel formula of deterrence and security as something that is required for Germany. It's completely new speak for Germany. Finally, I would not forget to mention the pressure from the public that plays a big role, and it's something that goes across the whole society. It's nothing that is just different for CDU or SPD. Many people say that Merkel is doing more social democratic politics than any other social democratic chancellor has done before. I would not subscribe to that, but as a matter of fact, there is a common, or a majority of the German population is in favor of a restrictive foreign policy, and that of course has also influence on how the policy is shaped. Anything I've missed? Well, I'll leave it with that, and we can figure out the next question.
Thanks so much. I'll pick up some of the themes. The first one, the revenge of geography. I think that's right, but at the same time, there's a tension between geopolitics, and, if you like, temporal, that is, time-based visions of the future. And the European Union, which we haven't fully mentioned yet, is precisely a body which reflects this tension. We often talk, Robert Cooper and others talk about the European Union as a postmodern entity. In other words, as postmodern, it doesn't do geopolitics, it believes in a future which would be post-sovereigntist even, sharing sovereignty and all the rest. In other words, there's a tension between norms and the norm-based system which the European Union claims to be, and the space in which it's taking place, because even this norm-based project is taking place in a physical environment, and at the moment of 28 states. And this tension between norms and space, if you like, is one which, of course, Germany shares within being at the heart of this European Union project. But what this has led to, and this is, I think, one of the major reasons for this crisis at the present time, is the incoherence of policy that European Union, and indeed often Germany, one could say, has not been fully aware of the power consequences of its own actions. So while on one side you're talking about a values-based system, which on the other end of it looks like values imperialism, and some of these endless tensions going on between norms and space and spatiality, and in fact almost the suppression of the vision of space. My second point is that in that context, okay, geopolitics is back, but it never went away. But within that context, we can think or identify, certainly I can identify 4 basic models of German external relations. In some part geopolitical, but not only. So 4 visions of German politics. The first one is an Atlanticist vision. This is the system which, well, you could say, began with Woodrow Wilsonian idealist politics after the First World War. But above all, after 1945, Atlanticism was the context in which the German state was rebuilt, and Atlanticism is the context in which it now continues. Yes, with all of its ups and downs and the crisis of 1968 and so on. But Germany is deeply embedded in the Atlantic security and political system, because Atlanticism isn't just about security, it's also about norms and values, which that tension, which I argue is within the European Union, is doubly intense or doubly powerful when it comes to Atlanticism. On the one side, it's full of this liberal universalism, rules-based system and institutionalism, and on the other side, it's a very old-fashioned traditional military alliance. And so this is embedded in the Atlantic Charter of 1941, and then, of course, it's the 1949 NATO founding charter itself is full of this great principles, but at the same time a power system. So this is the huge tensions. So there is, after 1945, a US-centered geopolitics emerged, accompanied by the Cold War and also the containment. And this is the core of the mythology of the contemporary German state. The great ideologist of this is Joseph Joffre, the myth of American decline, in other words, Uberpower, and so on. In other words, this at the extreme brooks no criticism of Atlanticism, and this Atlanticism has often closed down debate and discussion within Germany. That, in other words, some of the sacred shibboleths of Atlanticism cannot be questioned because it would then be changing the very self-identity of the German state, for good or ill. Of course, this Atlanticism has been shaken by the NSA spying case, by the Iraq War, as mentioned earlier, and certainly it doesn't. Atlanticism has never excluded some autonomy. France, in particular, under de Gaulle, was a classic example of this. So that's the first model, Atlanticist. However, there is a second model of German international politics, and let's call it, for convenience, German Eurasianism. This is the vision that Germany should be very much embedded, I feel like, on a continental vision. The key exemplar of this is Alexander Yar, in one way, and of course in some even Gerhard Schröder shared some of these ideas. The basic argument is that the unipolar world is a catastrophe and that there needs to be a continental vision. That European Union has lacked, needs to be Europeanized in a paradoxical way because it's too deeply embedded in the Atlantic systems. In other words, we need to Europeanize Europe, and Germany could be, and many, Sashagar and others argue that this should be the case. Germany and Russia need to work together to establish a pan-continental vision. This isn't an attempt to establish Europala or any new, well, at the extreme, some people talk about this as some sort of new alliance, Germany-Russia, and there was talk of this in the past, of course, the Berlin-Moscow axis, and it's still there within the German political imagination. Such like. We know that this view has influenced Steinmeier, maybe less so now, but it's only, and it's also, this view is much attacked and very much in the defensive. So the second model, German Eurasianism. The third idea is that Germany needs to show leadership in Europe. Munkler and others, that Germany needs to use its economic power to lead Europe and to use its central position for its advantage. That Germany has always felt hemmed in this central position, of course, 9 neighbours, as you say, and that this, obviously, in the past was considered a negative, and it's led to all sorts of tensions with leading to Grasrama and other elements, but now it's seen as a positive. It's like the heart of the European economic system, the political centrality between Anglo-American economic liberalism and Eurasian state capitalism, the German social model. So this third idea is of leadership, not just in spatial sense, but also in a political sense, but also the economic model sense, that Germany should stand very much a little bit more independently. And this seems to be in tune with Angela Merkel's thinking, leadership from the centre. So, as also, just very briefly, also reflected in some right-wing thinking, by the way, the new activism of German nationalism, Thilo Sarrazin and others. Just said briefly the fourth option. In the fourth option of a revived democratic and pluralistic Europe. This is the Germany, which I think we should never forget, the Germany of the old Ostpolitik. Of course, exemplar of that was Egon Bahr, who died just recently. This is the idea of engagement, transformation through engagement. This is the view that you work with states, not through democratic colour revolutions and so on, but can go back to the vision of transcending the very logic of conflict in Europe, the vision that Mikhail Gorbachev had at the end of the Cold War, the common European home, wider Europe today, greater European ideas. So this is the fourth option, and this fourth option, unfortunately, lacks any substantive partisans today, but nevertheless, it's still there, I think, on the table. Thank you. Just to say that when you mentioned that Germany is a legalistic view, of course, yes, that's absolutely the case. But, this is often, even this itself is a matter of interpretation. You could say that, coming to Ukrainian events, that the violation of rules was the overthrow of a legitimate government. So the romanticism of Maidan is a highly ambivalent phenomenon. We know that the sniper killings now were the work of Maidan forces themselves, and so on. So it's quite clear that whose law, in other words, are we talking about? This is the violation of the rules. The fact that the European Union did not defend its own agreement on the 21st of February. This is the deal brokered by the French Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius. He wasn't there by then. The Steinmeier and the Pole and Sikorski. So, in other words, you've got a deal which we now know, by the way, was forced on Yanukovych by Putin. Putin telephoned Yanukovych and actually says, sign up to this, even though Yanukovych, and part of that deal meant the withdrawal of armed forces from the Maidan, which left the regime completely defenseless against the armed formation. So in other words, let's not use in bad words, but some sort of a violent overthrow of a legitimate government, however odious, and then the overthrow of a deal brokered by the European Union itself, which for me is unbelievable, and this is why Putin constantly feels betrayed by these elements. And just to say that a word in favour of the, on the Crimean events. You could call it annexation, you could call it repatriation, but I'm moving more and more closely, personally, to the view that this was a secession. that this is a secession, and we know that international law is torn between self-determination and the sovereign integrity of states. We know that there's no simple way. We know for Kosovo, we know endless examples. And just one other thing, about the Donbass, it's quite clear that there was a movement, and well predating the fall of Yanukovych, for cultural self-determination, a linguistic issue. This cannot be overthrown. And if we're talking about this final point, that ultimately the tensions within Ukraine is between this monist vision of a ethno-cultural Ukraine and a more pluralistic vision of a multilingual, multinational society which has lacked so far constitutional establishment. In other words, the model of this Maidan revolution is a classic model of an anti-colonial, as if Russia is an anti-colonial power, as if these societies haven't developed for 800 years in a complex but nevertheless symbiotic relationship.
Right, the order then, so Stephen Walt and then Sergei LAGODINSKY.
This is not going to be a direct rejoinder at Sergei or anyone else, but I did. The one occupational hazard when you get intellectuals together to talk about anything is we immediately want to simplify things, and we want to insist that they have to be in one category or another. And I think Richard, when he laid out his 4 models, was doing what intellectuals do, and it's what I do too, so I'm not going to criticize that. But Gil began by pointing out, how do we explain the oscillations in German foreign policy? And again, it only looks confusing or looks like an oscillation if you think there needs to be one strategy. Now, as I emphasized, I think Germany has enormous difficulty actually formulating an independent foreign policy for a variety of historical and other reasons. But the oscillations of the last few years are actually not that confusing when you consider that the problems Germany has been trying to address are extremely hard to address. It would be astonishing if someone could develop a policy on day one and discover that it would work perfectly for the next 18 months or 2 years or whatever. So you're dealing with Ukraine. Ukraine is a deeply divided society. Anybody who thinks they have an easy answer for fixing Ukraine, raise your hand. Right? So wrestling with that problem is going to be easy regardless of what other states did. Then you have the problem of Russian interests in Ukraine, which are substantial. We may not like some of the things that Russia has done, but we have to recognize that they have interests there. There's the innate corruption of many of the other Ukrainian institutions. Then the fact that there are other countries in the region who have interests in what's going on there, and any German foreign policy to address the East is going to have to take those various interests into account as well. Last but not least, of course, the East was not the only thing that Germany was worried about over the last couple of years. One could argue it wasn't even necessarily the most important thing. Right? If you think the financial crisis was ultimately more substantial, then with 24 hours in a day and 7 days in a week, it was almost inevitable that German policy was going to oscillate the same way that Russian policy oscillated to some degree, the same way that American policy certainly oscillated to a considerable degree, and we're a long ways away, and we can afford to do that. But the sense that it's confusing, I think, is somewhat misleading, given the nature of the problems, the complexity of them, and the lack of obvious, surefire, easy-to-implement solutions. It's not surprising that we've seen some shifts back and forth in German policy.
Thank you, and thank you also for reacting to my couple of points. Just very briefly, I don't think it's productive if we're going to start arguing on facts. But since you started it, I will continue. Just to explain, overthrow of a legitimate government. First of all, there is always in a history an overthrow of a legitimate government, and it is seen as what they call in Germany an Urknall of a new legal regime, right? And Germans have overthrown their legitimate government in 1989. Nobody says that this was illegal. There is always this starting point for a new set of rules. I think that in this case, even Germans with their legalistic view understand that this is okay, especially if one's own government starts shooting at their own people. And please remember that the uprising actually started not after the most violent scenes started not after Yanukovych decided not to sign the agreement, but after it tried to suspend all the civil liberties in a way which was not legal. And I think we agree on that. And that was the starting point when the people and the masses said, if we don't act now, we will end up like our friends and relatives in Moscow. This is number one. Number two, I haven't heard any conclusive proof that this was Maidan forces. I know that this is an ambivalent situation, and there is a almost criminal, I would say, prolongation of the commission, which is trying to produce the results, but I haven't seen the results. Maybe I'm misinformed. I would rather leave it open as a statement of fact. And speaking of Crimea, there is a clear rule, there is a clear Budapest agreement where Russia was... I don't think we need to replay all the arguments again, because it's going to be boring. Everyone sitting here knows the arguments on both sides. Of course, I'm aware as an international legal expert, whatever you want to call it, about the tension between self-determination and right to sovereignty. But the question is, what do you do with this tension? And Russia clearly did with this tension something which a legal person, a legally minded person, does not see as fit for someone belonging to the nation of legally minded nations. So I do not see, I'm not even talking about the legal, the language assumptions that you're saying. I mean, do you speak, I think everyone speaks Russian.
Debate, yeah.
So if you go there and you know, and if you read the language law which Yanushenko actually produced and implemented, then you know exactly that the situation is more than ambivalent regarding the freedom of uses of various languages, and you know exactly that if you go to Kiev and if you go to Lemberg, you will be met with people who speak Russian, they are allowed to speak Russian, the whole TV landscape is in Russian. So these are all arguments that are used in a way which I would call propagandist, without accusing you of that, but we of course hear it from other points. And Steve said, and rightly so, Russians have interest in this, let's call it, sphere of interest as they perceive them, as everyone does. Absolutely. And I think that Germans always understood and agreed with that. The question is, how do you go about it? Do you invade another country to protect your interest, to defend your interest? Or do you find other ways? How do you deal with that? Do you formulate your aspirations and your demands as everyone legally minded would expect this? Or you don't, as people on the Russian side do? If you go to the foreign office here, the European Foreign Office, and talk there to people who said, we are ready to give Russians anything, well, not anything, but something that they would like to know. They should formulate it and put it on paper. What do you want? What concessions, I'm almost done. What concessions do you want to have? They don't produce any clear demands. And it's very hard to talk to someone on the other side who cannot even formulate their own demands without thinking that this someone is not interested in a clear agreement.
I'd just like to make a comment. There was going to be a second question, but we will be then running over and cutting into the question time, and I'm sure you have quite a few questions. So we will now have the response of Hans-Joachim GIESSMAN, and we will, after that, open the floor to discussions, to questions.
All right, a couple of small points. First one, I mentioned already that Germany is trying to find its role, and it's torn between the expectation that are forwarded to Germany to become a leader in Europe and to define what this role of a leader in Europe could be. And we should not forget that Germany is looked at from different perspectives, with ideas of hope, but also with ideas of mistrust. So it is a kind of tightrope walk of a country that is the strongest actor in Europe to play a role that is considered to be to the benefit of all other European countries. Secondly, we in Germany, and I can read that every day in our newspapers, feel the growing pressure on Germany as considered to be the European powerhouse in a situation where the economic growth in Europe has been to a large extent at the expense of the other European countries, and this pressure now comes back to Germany, and the request for responsibility to contribute to the resolution of this economic and financial crisis for Europe is increasing, and so under the current circumstances of the refugee flood, for example, this understanding that the situation might get out of control is growing, and I think that is also playing a role for Germany's for efforts, most recent efforts to find a leeway, to find a way out of this crisis. Thirdly, also due to the failed crisis management in the last decades, or last 5-10 years, let's say that way, there are more and more requests forwarded to Germany to become an active crisis manager in countries where Germany has not been involved so far. And all of these countries are very difficult countries. It is Syria, it is Yemen, it is Sudan, it is Libya, because first of all, Germany does not have the colonial baggage. On the other hand, other countries have lost the credibility by local actors. So Germany is invited to play a bigger role, but it has not yet a clear concept how to deal with that issue. So, but it's additional pressure, and I do see the current efforts also to not to embrace but to engage Russia as part of that understanding that if Germany wants to be successful in fulfilling this role, it has to have a constructive relationship with the Russian Federation. And my last point is relates to Crimea. I do not want to open the fuss again, but it's some of the same point. There is an understanding that there is no military solution for this situation there, but there's also an understanding that the situation as it stands now cannot be resolved without the consent of the majority of the population of Crimea. And so it's a kind of a catch-22 situation that we are facing, and the question is whether this situation withholds us from trying to resolve those issues that can be resolved cooperatively, Syria, ISIS, etc., or if we think that these issues have to be repaired or changed first before establishing cooperation. And I think that is the current dilemma and the current dispute amongst the international community.
I'll speak on behalf, or not on behalf of the United States, but at least from an American perspective. I think that the American policy towards Russia has actually been very confused, and has been confused throughout the post-Cold War period. We have never actually been able to figure out an approach towards dealing with Russia that's been consistent or successful. There was a period in the 90s where we were sort of cautiously welcoming Russia. It was a period of great Russian weakness, and the United States welcomed Russia as a friendly country, provided it didn't object to any of the things we decided to do. Then that was followed by a period where we took a slightly more confrontational position towards Russia. This was the Bush administration when we, for example, abrogated the anti-ballistic missile treaty, a pointless act on our part, which didn't help things at all, and relations deteriorated, not surprisingly. President Obama is elected, and it begins the so-called reset period, you might recall, where we were going to once again rebuild a reasonably positive relationship with Russia. But my interpretation of this was, again, it was based on the idea that what was ours, and what Russia believed in was negotiable. And so we would continue to expand NATO if we felt like it. We would support continued movements into Eastern Europe by the EU if that was a good idea. And we would pay as little attention as possible to Russian interests, and not surprisingly, things have deteriorated. Now, one could argue that those were the right policies. There's a case to be made, but the idea that we should be surprised that our relationship with Russia has deteriorated, I think, is not all that surprising. And then just finally, I think Putin has played a very weak hand fairly well. Right? He has, I think, taken the idea of expanding NATO into Ukraine or Georgia off the table permanently or semi-permanently, which was, I think, a major goal. We may not like it, but it was a major goal of his, and I think he's accomplished that. And as we've seen now in the Middle East, he has reinserted Russia in some useful ways, largely, again, on the heels of a series of failed American policies over the last 20 years or so. Anyway, my short answer to your question is no, we have never figured out exactly what we wanted our relationship with Russia to be, and how we could strike a balance between a relationship where the United States was going to be substantially more powerful, substantially more influential, and yet would have to recognize Russian interests, at least in some areas and at certain times. We've never done a particularly good job of striking that balance.
Please, over here.
Tatiana Stein from the European Parliament. My question is to Mr. LAGODINSKY. You told that Germany mirrored itself. My question is why Germany does not, or certain circles in Germany, does not mirror themselves to the situation of raising of neo-Nazi forces in Ukraine as well as in Baltic states. I have read some publications of Heinrich Stiftung saying that you don't need to pay too much attention to neo-Nazi forces in Ukraine since it will weaken our fight against Putin.
Thanks for this very important question. I am not aware of any publications where they would say, by the Heinrich Böll Foundation, where the foundation would say that you should not pay any attention to neo-Nazis. In fact, we actually do work a lot on questions of nationalism, Nazism, etc. So I would be really surprised if we had any, at least under my auspices, there is no such publication, I can assure you of that. What we do work on is the impact of Russia on neo-Nazis in Europe and on right-wing populists in Europe. And this is also a very interesting question, and I understand that your question did not actually look in that direction. I just wanted to mention it, that this is an interesting twist of events where you have neo-Nazis gathered in St. Petersburg in one of the large hotels under the auspices of one of the people close to the Russian government. So the situation is ambivalent on all sides of this equation, but we do, and I think the German government does reiterate that, of course, no nationalism and no Nazism is acceptable within borders of the European Union, and it has done so many times. But if you look at the polls and at the election results in Ukraine, you see how minor the Nazis do come out of elections. At least this was the result of the past election. We have to see how it is going to develop now that the government is really doing not a great job in transforming the country, and where these forces can gain power and momentum. As for the Baltic states, this is absolutely a valid point, and we have to see that freedom of speech, is of course a high value that we all cherish, but freedom of speech does not include nationalists and Nazis especially spreading their hatred. So I think that the European Union and Germany is quite clear-cut on that. What it is not clear-cut on is when these arguments are being abused by other side in terms of for propagandistic purposes. For example, calling Kiev a Nazi junta, despite the fact that some members of this government were either Armenians or Jewish and really have not much to do with Nazis.
Please, the question, yes, please. And the second will be yours.
Thank you. My name is Jan Techer. I'm working for Carnegie Europe here in Brussels. One quick comment and a very short question. The comment, I think we were talking about confusion in the German position, and you could construct it that way, of course, by looking at Minsk and looking at sanctions and seeing that they somehow work together. But I think that's actually not really the main point that we should be looking at when we want to determine the position of Germany in Europe at the moment and its position vis-à-vis Russia. I think the key element that we should be looking at is the motivation for the big turn that the Merkel government did after Ukraine, which was a substantial turn. It was Germany traditionally was a relatively Russia-friendly country in its foreign policy, always trying to take a middle position. But after Ukraine, that changed suddenly, and it changed for one particular reason. And I think that it was MH17 and these things play a role, and also the lost trust between Macron and Putin personally. But I think the major turn was that when Germany saw that the post-Cold War order, which was really created not in 1991, but with NATO expansion and EU enlargement, was a threat. This was a mortal threat to Germany, because the post-Cold War order that with these expansions had absolved Germany from its impossible geopolitical situation in the center of Europe. All of a sudden, the impossibility of being in the middle of the continent was possible for Germany, surrounded by friends, saturated, embedded in alliances. And that peace order became very, very instrumental for the Germans in their viewing of themselves. When that was threatened by Crimea, and then subsequently by the other actions taken by Mr. Putin, the Germans all of a sudden realized that what they had considered to be, that the imagination that they had that Russia was part of the security architecture of Europe was actually an illusion. And that's when the reaction set in, and that's when the turnaround came. The Germans are very much inclined to keep that order intact. And once they found out that it was actually threatened, and substantially threatened by a player that they wanted to trust, this is why it took them longer to realize that Russia wasn't part of it, when they realized that the partner that they wanted to be inside that order was actually undermining that order, then the turn happened. And it didn't only change the Merkel personally, it turned to a large extent in the political elite of Germany. Newspapers changed their tone very, very quickly, observed, and it wasn't just a fashion. It was a realization that the German dream, in a sense, and an absolving of their own geopolitical situation in the center of Europe was a threat. My quick question to you on the panel, what do you make of the German support or indirect support of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which is a strategic project, and which is seen by some as undermining, the strong position on Russia, because it basically enables Russia again to bypass strategic parts of Eastern Europe and its gas business. It seems a technical issue, but it was taken by many as, as a deeply worrying kind of, weirdness on behalf of the Germans, and perhaps the flip-flopping lies more in that than in any of the other things that we've talked about.
Please, who wants to respond?
I think that you've made a fundamental point, the one about the dissolution of that, what the Germans perceived to have been that post-Cold War peace order. And, I don't disagree with what you said. I think it's a very powerful analysis. But I could turn it upside down. And the way you could then see it in a different way is that that peace order at the end of the Cold War was never established, that we have lived for 25 years in what I now have come to start describing the 25 years crisis, reference to it, that we know from the very beginning. Yeltsin used this term, the Cold Peace, in December 1994. So this has been 25 years, 1989 to 2014. that 25 years crisis in which none of the fundamental questions of European security, the fundamental question of what Europe is for, the vision of Europe has failed, that the vision of Gorbachev at the end of the Cold War, of a common victory in the Cold War, every single postulate which could have been the foundation for an inclusive and universal peace order at the end of the Cold War was perceived, certainly by Moscow, to have been betrayed, and not only Moscow. I mean, I've been criticizing it from the very first days in the 1990s. I've always said that this has been a failure, that how can you actually build a peace order on the unilateral sense that the institutions that were already there, that is the European Union, NATO and so on, would enlarge when the other side, even if you don't agree with them, was not happy with it, and it was quite clear they were not happy with it. And if Germany and Brussels and Washington, and obviously we don't expect London to have seen it, then see it, and then that this should have come as a shock in 2014, is just simply beyond belief. That we know that everybody's been saying this. Who isn't listening? Why isn't there dialogue? Why isn't there an understanding of a larger... This doesn't mean to justify it, that this crisis has been building up. The 2008 Russo-Georgian War was a clear indication that the system is in crisis. So that's the first thing. And as for Nord Stream, the very formulation of that question is next to what strategic... I mean, who is it damaging? And the Poles are complaining, others are complaining, simply incomprehensible. Because on the other side... Why? Again, this is a sign of this 25 years crisis, that the European Union is talking about an energy union now and diversity of supplies. Okay, it makes sense. But what about the guaranteed security of the supply? And so endless language of cutting out Gazprom and so on is just a sign of the utter failure from mutual dependence to become what people used to call interdependence. And that's just another symptom of this larger 25 years failure. Now we need to start thinking, how do we move beyond this? And the only way to say is, first of all, a recognition in the West of the mistakes that we've made, a bit of humility from the European Union, a lot of humility from Germany, which has actually been forging this order, which we now see was built on foundations of sand.
Please.
I just wanted to add an echo to what was just said. I thought your summary of German foreign policy and its sense of a peaceful order and its position in Europe was very astute. I thought that captured much of the sense of concern that you saw in Germany, so I don't disagree with anything in your comment at all. I would just add, though, that there's a fundamental sort of conceptual issue here, and that is that Western insistence, both in Europe but also especially in the United States, that liberal democracy is ultimately the only acceptable form of government. All others are imperfect. All others are deeply flawed. That is, whether we like it or not, going to be innately threatening by its own nature to any non-liberal democracy. We are effectively saying, if the opportunity presented itself, we would like to see your government change. And we shouldn't be surprised if some of those governments react in ways that we find somewhat harmful. I like liberal democracy as much as anybody. I'm really glad I live in one. But I'm also aware of what happens when any state or group tries to insist that others have to ultimately adapt. And if I would point to another error of the last 20 years, it has been the effort, especially by my country, to accelerate a historical process, right, and get disasters in response. So it's possible that the end result of human evolution will be liberal democracy all over the world, but that's going to be a very long and difficult process. And we have tried to, I think, accelerate it. I think we moved too quickly to try and pull Ukraine in. I think we certainly moved too quickly in Libya to try and get rid of a thuggish dictator when we had no idea what to replace it with. I think, of course, the United States did the same thing in Iraq, and we saw what the results there were as well. So even if liberal democracy is a wonderful thing, it took hundreds of years to develop it in the West. It will take a long time to bring it to other parts of the world, and accelerating that process is actually sometimes going to backfire and cause events like we've seen in the last several years.
Thank you very much. My name is Walt. I'm head of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, social democratic think and do tank, with offices in all Central and Eastern European countries and in Russia, obviously, since 1987. First of all, I mean, I'm tempted to make a lot of comments, which I won't do, but I want to briefly thank Stephen Walt for doing away with this notion of confusion. I think there's no confusion at all. It's totally normal that Germany goes slow and deliberates well what it does in a situation where the international order has practically gotten out of hand for everybody. So it's an overstretch we feel not only in German foreign policy, but also in American foreign policy, in European foreign policy. There is definitely an overstretch for the instruments we have to deal with the amount of crisis we are facing at the moment. Then another episodical comment to the last thing Stephen Walt mentioned, and then I will come to Russia and Germany. I think Germany has as much a problem with the US missionary approach to democracy promotion, which is always geared on regime change, as it has with changes in other countries' foreign policy behavior. And we as political foundations know that. We were welcome for decades in most of the countries where we went. And since the American 3 wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and since the interventions, the working conditions for democracy promoting agencies have become significantly more difficult because the normative approach in favor of regime change has cut off relations to countries who might not have had nice leaderships, but they had stability and they had functioning states. And now we are dealing with failed states, and in a failed state you have hardly any possibility to negotiate with anybody. Now, as my question, as for Russian politics, I'm wondering a lot that one aspect was not mentioned in the debate at all until now, and that is that we apparently face a change in the political advisors in the Kremlin. During the 90s, the political advisors of the Russian leaders were all from the generation who had lived through the Second World War, had lived through the Cold War, and had a more or less unified vision of the world. In the meantime, there seem to be advisors in the Kremlin who have little memories in this respect. They were not personally attached by the Cold War order so much, and not at all by the Second World War. But they have lived their professional careers in a de facto democracy since 1990. And they are now in leading positions. And they have no commitment with the Soviet society, but a commitment with their personal careers and with a bunch of people who came along in the problematic transition process in Russia. So my question would be, if you have any more detailed information about these new advisors to the Kremlin. Last week I was in Warsaw together with Javier Solana, and we had a long interview at Gazeta Wyborcza. And the Polish intellectuals are totally convinced that in the meantime in Russia there is a group of people advising the presidency, who have a totally different worldview. They are rewriting history. They are rewriting history systematically, and they have a different vision of how they want to shape the world. And these people are taking risks, as in hybrid wars, for example, in Ukraine. So the question would be a little bit if you have any further information. And a last very short comment, I think what Sergei LAGODINSKY said, that especially the SPD politicians who had long-standing good relations to Russia and to Russian intellectuals and politicians and so on, they have experienced the same thing I'm saying. They are talking to people they talked to in the 90s, and the discourse of the Russian people who talked in the 90s in a certain manner is totally different today. They tell you something different about the vision they have about Europe, the world, and other things.
We had one more. Before the panel takes this question, we have one more question. It's here, and then we will round up.
Thank you. My name is Robert van der Meulenbroek, and I'm a Belgian ambassador retired. I'll have a short question and a shorter comment. My short question is, one of the long-standing complaints of President Putin is that the Eastern European countries, after the fall of the wall, 1989, should not become NATO members. And he bases himself on a promise that has been made by European politicians, US politicians, I don't know who. The version I heard is that, in fact, the newly independent Eastern European countries asked themselves to become members of NATO. Now, what is the right version? Were they kept out because it was promised to Mr. Putin, or was it an independent decision on their behalf? And then my comment to Dr. GIESSMAN, catch-22 situation on Crimea, I'm not sure. It's a clear violation of international law. It's an invasion. It goes against the Memorandum of Budapest, one. And second, of course, there's been an election in Crimea, but it was not monitored independently. And I think it was almost 99.9% in favor of becoming a Russian territory. So where is the catch-22? Thank you.
Well, starting with the catch-22, the catch-22 was related to the question whether to re-establish the original situation should become a precondition for collaboration with Russia on other areas, and I think that is the point. If you want to constructively engage with Russia on other issues, other current crises, then you have to make a decision, either to do that or to not to do that, and wait for a Russian revision of its former policies. My point was not on Crimea, but on how to deal with Russia in this very situation where they have illegally annexed a part of Ukraine. So that was my point. If I may, because I have the floor anyway. I have no clue about the advisors in Russia, but what I know and what makes me concerned is that the Russian society has changed over time, and they have a growing middle class in this country, which was very critical vis-à-vis Putin in the past, and which now apparently tends to support him for a variety of reasons, which have to do with the national recourse, which have to do with the economic upturn in the 90s, which now may fade away partly, and then also with his rebuttal policy vis-à-vis the West. That is something that pays off for Putin today, and which makes it more easy for him just to behave in the way he does behave. I would like to pick up one thing that you asked about, does Germany have a Russia policy? I would say, yes, it has. It's still a policy of constructive engagement, and I think what is the problem here is that, I think Sergei LAGODINSKY mentioned that briefly before, it is not enough to have a modernization partnership. What has gone lost more or less a security partnership with Russia. So there's no security partnership. We work together with Russia on areas or on issues that are far away from Europe. Iran, for example, that was successful. Maybe Syria becomes also a successful case of collaboration. But there is no common understanding currently about how the European security system should look like. And it relates to a variety of issues, including arms control. We have the conventional arms accord, which was ratified by Russia, Kazakhstan, and Belarus, which is on hold. There's no conventional arms control treaty in Europe. There are other arms control mechanisms that are at risk or suspended, basically. So I think that whatever we do to come up with a security partnership and an agenda, how to come up with an agenda that is based on the agreed rules of the international law and the principles of the Helsinki Accord. That is, I think, the primary task. And my last point is on sanctions. I did not understand why the sanctions against Russia were imposed a couple of weeks after the East Normandy format was established. I mean, if sanctions have a role, then they should provide an incentive to change behavior. If it's just a punishment only, they will not change anything. And if the European countries want to use sanction as a smart tool for providing incentives to Russia to change its behavior, then it must be based on criteria, which I do miss currently.
Yes, you want to?
Yeah?
All right. So, Sergei.
Is this the final round?
That's the final round.
Oh, I didn't know that.
If, you see, that's why I asked. If it's a final round, then I'm going to try to cover more. I do agree with you. I think you mentioned it. Germany does have a strategic outlook on its policies towards Russia. It does want to engage Russia. It does want to basically everything that was part of the modernization partnership is still valid, but there are preconditions for this. It is being viewed as possible and constructive only in the framework where international norms are respected, and in a framework where Europeans, not only Germans, Europeans, are able to keep their liberal identity and their security. And both is perceived as being threatened now by our Russian partners. And as long as there is this perception of threat, whether this threat is real or not, cooperation is very difficult. So if you look at the Baltic states, at Poles, etc., we are there really in a very precarious situation. And this is also valid for a threat of European liberal identity, because there is too much noise coming from Moscow trying to intervene into internal understanding of Europeans and to instrumentalize forces that are actually anti-European and acting within the European Union. So there is a mistrust there, and I think this is also important to see. Very briefly to Nord Stream, and it shows the ambivalence of German policy towards Russia. It shows, from my perspective, this need to engage and to threaten, to sanction and to engage. And I think that the deal, I think even more interesting is the deal that the BASF is doing now with gas utilities, which is going to take place, because this is real strategic asset that is going to be controlled by Gazprom if this deal goes through, and it looks like it would go through. So this was also would be a threat to strategic and to energy independence in Europe, despite the European Energy Union, which is planned now. And very briefly to the question that Steve mentioned and also Uwe mentioned, is the question of how do we deal with this new competition of societal models that we're seeing now, and with the fact that our understanding of the end of history, of a kind of a linear movement toward the liberal democracy as the model where everyone is going to meet and shake hands, is not going to happen. And I think that there we have a difference on several subjects. It's not enough to say that we do not want to have a regime change, and I don't think we should say that we want to have a regime change, but very often it's not about regime change. It's about obeying and fulfillment of commitments that these countries have actually entered to. Russia is part of OSCE, Russia is part of Council of Europe, it's a signatory of Human Rights Convention and the European Convention on Human Rights. Look what is happening there with political freedoms. it's not that someone has imposed it on Russia. Russia, maybe not this government, but the previous government, have imposed it upon themselves. So the question is, where does the regime change start? And where is it about human rights and self-commitment? And as for the sanctions, I actually do think that the sanctions were not thought through, but in a different way. I think that the salami tactics of sanctions at the beginning was a big mistake. Right after the Crimea occupation, invasion, cessation, whatever you want to call it, but after the involvement of the Russian side in that process, we should have targeted hits right away and very hard. What we saw was the opposite. European Union was cautious. They were kind of doing the screw, turning the screws step by step, and there was this dynamics that the other side was trying to get more, to get more before the next round of sanctions came. So I think this was the mistake, and I do agree that there was a strategic mistake in strategic calculations there. They were too hesitant to do a targeted personal sanctions. They would have worked at the beginning. Now you cannot achieve much with them.
I'm going to make two comments, and then I'm going to end with two questions of my own for everyone to ponder. Just in response to this gentleman's questions, my understanding of the issue of were promises made to Russia about NATO expansion is that we have the worst of all possible outcomes. If you will go back and look carefully through the diplomatic record there, it's clear that some U.S. officials, I think in particular then Secretary of State James Baker, made some verbal assurances in several meetings, but these were not written down. The Russians did not insist that they get recorded and written down. So we have the worst situation where the Russians genuinely believe that assurances were made, and the Americans can say that, well, no, we really didn't. Right? And therefore both sides can see the other as misbehaving subsequently. Very bad situation. Second, my own view of this, and it's somewhat antithetical to NATO ideology, is that countries do not have a right to be in NATO even if they meet all of the membership criteria. That an alliance is something that even if you meet all the membership criteria and you really want to get in, it's still up to the members of NATO to decide whether or not to let you in, whether it's in the interest of everyone in the alliance to have you in. And in particular, it's probably not a good idea to keep extending Article 5 guarantees to countries that you can't easily defend, right? And where, at least according to some recent public opinion polls in some countries, a majority of the population wouldn't want to actually defend them. So occasionally you hear that people who are opposed to further NATO expansion are denying the rights of countries that want to be NATO members. No non-member nation state has a right to be in. It's up to NATO to decide if that's a good idea or not. Now my two questions. As we look ahead, and again thinking about German foreign policy, what happens when the declining American interest in Europe becomes more and more apparent? Not that the United States is going to be hostile to Europe, not that the United States is going to be economically disengaging from Europe, but America's strategic attention has been declining, in Europe has been declining for 20 years, and that process is likely to continue. So where does that leave Europe if increasingly the idea that Uncle Sam will take care of this problem if it gets bad enough, right? If that no longer is as credible, and I think again here Germany's role in the Ukraine crisis is a harbinger of things to come. Obviously Germany's role in the financial crisis as well. And by the way, if the United States is shifting to Asia and focusing much more of its attention on China, NATO and Europe is not going to be part of any American effort to retain a position in Asia. And all you have to do is look at David Cameron's recent statements about how Britain's economic interests are in moving closer to China, and you see how that process could go. And then my second question is, what happens to German foreign policy when the German powerhouse of the last 10 or 15 years, economic powerhouse, falters? as it inevitably will, because no economy does well every year forever. So at some point when the German economy suddenly slumps, right, then this assumption that Germany is always in a position to lead Europe is going to be questioned. And I don't have a clear answer to that question, but perhaps some of you do.
On the point about Putin's advisors from Adam Michnik and others, I mean, I just think it's wrong. There's no evidence. I don't know who these people are they're thinking of. They imagine Putin's system and hasn't. I mean, it's evolved in many ways, but the system has remained fundamentally the same. That is, it's based on a network of factions. Some older people, some younger people, different people, but basically it's a type of faction. I mean, the economic bloc is still Siluanov and so on are relatively liberal modernizers, including pension reform, finally grasping that fundamental issue. Of course, there's crazies like Sergei and others around, who's now been more marginalized, by the way, even though he's been quite active. But yet the old guard is still there. Okay, Yakunin is out, but Sergei Ivanov is absolutely essential to it. Sergei Lavrov still managing for a decade and more foreign policy. So no, it's a false model. But substantively, I mean, Russia supporting right-wingers in Europe, I think, but also supporting left-wingers, Syriza, Podemos and others. So basically it'll find allies where it can find them, where it'll use allies where it can find them, and it's not too choosy, which is perhaps a bad thing, and so on. As for German zigzags, maybe I didn't make myself clear. The reason why I was trying to outline these four models is to say that ultimately Germany is torn between these four models. I mean, it's a simple fact that too much policy has been tactical. It hasn't been strategic. And in the sense of strategic, one would say, really, where are we going? Okay, you talk about this liberal internationalism and so on. That's abstract. What specifically are we going to do? And touching on Stephen's point there, I mean, how are we going to establish a genuinely European Europe which is based on solidarity, which can actually take sovereign decisions about its own security without actually having missile defense systems popped into East European countries? And these East European countries, don't forget, have never been adequately socialized within the European Union. Germany's done a lot to try to do so. They calmed down, Germany calmed down Karl Bildt and Radek Sikorski when the Eastern Partnership was initially devised in a very, very hostile manner, and it was calmed down and so on. But nevertheless, it emerged still as a contentious issue. So there hasn't been a fundamental division on what does, okay, as European strategic attention inevitably will, it's quite clear it's going to go in due course. Atlanticism cannot last forever, and that we simply have no answers. We simply have no answers, and even it's getting worse. Don't forget, we're talking about TTIP, Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership, which many people call an economic NATO. So you talk about this declining. It's actually a last gasp, and not only TTIP, but the way it's been negotiated, and that is secret. This stuff on energy policy, where they were desperately begging, which I find humiliating, the EU position was to US strategic energy reserves to be released onto the market, both to beat Russia and also such a... I mean, what sort of language is this? The European Union has transformed itself from a peace project to also establishing a dynamic of conflict. It isn't actually, it's almost repudiating its very essence in recent years. So maybe it's a British person's. But the worst thing of all, talking about Crimea, and I really will go back to this, because it's no good just simply declaring international law. Okay, there's many contentious issues, Kosovo and such like. But also, one of the tragedies of our time, and it's come to this, as I keep saying, is that when we quote Henry Kissinger with approbation, okay, he's a great realist, great guy, and I really did enjoy his latest book on world order. But nevertheless, just in his recent interview, Henry Kissinger said, I mean, who in their right mind really thinks that Russia, after spending over $50 billion on the Sochi Winter Olympics. And the whole point of the Olympics was to say we're back as part of a peace order within a cultural order within Europe and the world, and so on. A week later, goes around invading and trampling over and such like. Kissinger recognises this is inconceivable. Therefore, we need to understand the logic of how did Russia get into this, which no one denies, no one questions, and I've been saying it for years. It's a disaster. There's no question about it. International law is a mess. The whole thing is a disaster, but it's no good simply blaming and projecting onto a scapegoat in a classic Girardian manner. This is a scapegoat mechanism, and the European Union really should start looking at itself, not just looking to Washington for answers. remain in alliance, but we as Europeans need to start asking some serious questions. And this is why one of my jokes that, as I say, we have gone from Gorby, that's Gorbachev, to Corby, our Jeremy Corbyn in the UK. Well, how did he get his 60%? It's a movement. It's a movement really in revolt and indeed in revulsion at the hypocrisy and the failure of the European Union and European political leaders, really to substantively engage in a continental vision of unification, transcending the logic of conflict. Instead, all we've seen for 25 years is a perpetuation of a low-level, rather pathetic Cold War. We've never really transcended its dynamic. So, Russia in all of this is not a revisionist power. Even Kissinger recognises this. It's not a revisionist power. And many others, neither is China, of course. You could call them neo-revisionist. They're unhappy with the way the system works. They do not repudiate the basis of international law, as I don't think Putin's speech yesterday at the United Nations was in any way cynical. It was hard-hitting, and he was actually laying out, if you're talking about refugees, let's look at the causes and the sources of it all, and so on. And it was a genuine attempt to say, let's go back to that moment, not of the moment of the transcendence of the Cold War, and this is why Gorbachev also says this, the moment of Malta, when we had a power transition. We didn't really have what Gorbachev wanted, and Russia still demanding a transcendence of old-style politics, a transcendence of Egon Bahr sort, of genuine engagement and dialogue. And just one final point. Michael McFarlane, as I've been saying, wouldn't it how different European and world politics would look if Russia had become a democracy? Yep, sure. But you could turn that upside down. How much more likely would it have been for Russia to have become a better democracy if the geopolitics had been sorted and European security had been sorted rather earlier, which on an inclusive basis, which has made some hard decisions. It wouldn't have been easy. But if it had been done, then Russia would have been a more cooperative, effective member of the European and global community. Unfortunately, we're in a terrible mess. I shouldn't say, I've been spending a lot of time in Crimea with Crimeans, and so the key answer there is, the sheer passion and engagement of people for Crimea returning to Russia is something which I don't even know. It should be perhaps some sort of an internationally supervised
Ask the Tatars who
indeed, I do
not agree with them.
No, indeed. Not Genevieve, but the genuine Tatars in Crimea, yeah. Sure,
okay, well, gentlemen, thank you so much, and I thank the audience for some very perceptive and challenging questions. And with that, we close. Thank you. So I hope you've